Okay, so everyone had enough time to think?
Yep.
So fire away to me.
Yeah, so basically, for me was just be with my mates, and I just enjoy playing. I just love playing football. That's it.
Did things change when you became a teenager? Were you changing?
No, not done as much. No, I still have pretty much same, affection with the football and like to play every time I have a chance to do that. Unless there was other, different reasons, but generally, no. Generally, it was important to just go and play. That was important to me.
Okay. Anyone else on that point?
That was the same with me, except there were probably a couple of really quiet changes when I was a teenager. So first trials in Norwich, so I got a bit more sick, and then sort of playing for the county, and then there was a bit of a money motivation towards the end of my teenage years.
It's a great thing to think about. So I like that question. What were you like as a teenager? Because we're often very different as a teenager to what we were like as a child.
Yeah.
Aidan, Sam, Prem, anything from you?
Yeah, well, as a teenager, I was just like wanting to win all the time, to be honest, in a football pitch. So I think in that aspect, my reason for playing football changed, because I started just for fun and playing with mates, as I'm sure everyone else's was, and then I started to become more dedicated to it, really, and then started to want to win more, to be honest, because I didn't really like losing.
Yeah, like for me, it got more serious, more structured. So as a teenager, I got involved with the senior team, and it I didn't have as much fun as I had playing with my mates, because playing with much older players, you're kind of more stressed, and I actually started playing less because of that, because I was enjoying it. So yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I also had friends. I got into football because of friends. I lived pretty much on a road where I knew everyone who was at my school. 2 or 3 years older. Just started playing with them. Got on the street. Me and Aidan probably the last year group who are going to play in the streets all day in the holidays now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that question of just what you were like as a teenager? Forgetting football.
Not good.
Moody.
I was a
like the mood changed very quickly. So one time you can be very happy, then in the next, a minute or so, you can be very angry for whatever reason. And I think, and not always go as a flow, not logical thinking behind too often. Just we go to this. So you do stupid things. Because I think, you not develop that awareness, what the consequences might be of that behavior.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think I've done few in my teenage years, of course. I think everybody does. Yeah. But you don't realize, you don't have that. So that's the teenage brain in that sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure.
And I think you think you're very important when you're a teenager, and it's like too much ego.
Yeah, you've made it, haven't you? I'm an adult now, so I've made it. It's interesting that lots of us go through that stage where, as a teenager, what's important to us starts to change, and it can affect things in our coaching environment. So it's a discussion point, and it will become relevant as we go through. So let's move along. So in terms of the agenda and what I want to go through tonight. So first off, little bit of background in terms of the brain structure and how it develops, having a look at what puberty is against what adolescence is, and the difference between the two, what the teenage brain looks like, and then the conclusion of what it means to us. So we'll crack on. If we think first off about brain structure and development, so the picture of a brain on the screen there, and in all honesty, they all look very similar in terms of size and structure. We all got one, whatever anyone thinks. And if we still believe today what we believed back in the 1980s, then we would live by the rule that the brain cells you were born with are the ones that you're going to die with. Now, what we've since found in terms of science is that we can actually nurture our cells and use them more. But actually, science has told us that we can grow what we call brain neurons through something called neurogenesis. Now, I'm not going to give you too much in terms of technical detail, but I think it's important for what we're going to discuss going on. Now, neurogenesis, as a definition, is the process by which the nervous system cells, or the neurons, are produced by natural stem cells. Now, it's crucial in embryonic development, so as you're developing in the womb as a baby, but it does continue in certain brain regions throughout our lives. But it does slow down considerably upon adulthood. So it's the different parts of the brain that we use in order to create every function that we have as a human being, be it speech, movement, communication, developing emotions, things like that. Our emotional responses will often heighten through the growth of those cells in early years development. So what that looks like is, as a baby, babies cry a lot. And it's an emotional development of, that's what I do to get what I want. If you think about a child growing up, as they become a toddler, you start to have the tantrums when they don't quite get what they want. And as we go up and through youth development and into teenage years, it comes out sometimes in terms of anger and things like that, as we slowly evolve those emotional senses. Now, we do also actually have the ability to rearrange the neurons within our brain depending on who we communicate with. And that's a process called neuroplasticity. Again, it's sometimes called neuroelasticity, and it's the ability of the brain to develop a new neurological pathway. So it's the connection and the behavior depending on or in response to new information, sensory stimulation, development, damage, or dysfunction. So it's what triggers us to create a response. So we start to learn a pathway. If you prick your finger, it hurts. And you develop the pathway in your brain that sends the signal to the specific part of your brain that tells you that it hurts. And that becomes quicker because it becomes neurological connection between those parts. Our behavior and our responses will change depending on what we've seen, heard, or felt during our development. So people react differently in different situations depending on the life that they've led up to that point. So things might happen where somebody becomes extremely irritated by something and other people can dust it off. And it's to do with the early development of those neurosystems along our sensory pathway. So we often talk about then going forward. So sorry, I've just lost my own screen. Something called mindfulness. Now, mindfulness is probably the most important of these things that I'll talk about. And it's the fact that we're capable of observing our own neurocircuitry within our brain. So it means that we're able to change our thoughts and behaviors within our brains so that we can pick and choose what's going on in our heads. So a lot of people will structure that neurocircuitry as a development in their behavior. So let's give it a real life example. A child that is often badly behaved, and little things will start to spark high emotions. When you become older, it's a lot easier to pick and choose how you make that feel, or how you make that reaction feel to yourself in order to create your own circuitry. Some people that have got potentially learning difficulties will find that harder than the majority of people. Does that make sense to everyone? So I know it's a little bit scientific, but it's just giving us a bit of background. Most importantly, when we think about those circuits, what happens in our heads is that we think a thought. We then stimulate an emotion, and we then have a physical response. Now, all of that happens in less than 90 seconds. So the beginning of a thought that would stimulate an anger circuit, resulting in a physiological response that flushes adrenaline through your body and out again. So something happens and it creates anger within you, and you produce a physiological response, be it gritted teeth, clenched fists, reddening of the face and the anger. For that to come in and go out takes less than 90 seconds. Now, what you can take from that is that if something makes you angry and you are still angry more than 90 seconds later, it's because you are rethinking the thought that stimulates that response. So actually, you're creating the anger yourself. Now, as adults, we have an awful lot more ability to control that than a child does. And in teenage years, and we'll find in a little while, it can go haywire. So ultimately, we put out the trigger that makes us angry on a pedestal for somebody to go and touch, that creates our neurocircuitry, that tells us we've got to be angry, and we create that anger and we become calm again. To continue the anger, you've got to keep thinking the thought. Make sense? Cool. Okay. Now, throughout history, people have talked about being left brain and right brain. Just as a nod of heads, everyone heard that before. You're either left-brained or right-brained. Yeah. The left-hand side of your brain is all that stuff that creates logic. It helps you with your analysis, to define words, to compute things, remembering lines of songs and facts. Your right brain is all to do with your creativity, your imagination, your holistic thoughts, all the things that are listed there on the screen. Now, it's true, but in our early development, we determine our neurological pathways and what we have a tendency to prefer. So as a child growing up, you decide which is easier to think about, logic or emotion. And that helps to define the person that you go on to become. Now, scientifically, stimulation coming in through our sensory system travels all the way up your spinal cord and aims for the outer portion of your brain, which is actually called the cerebral cortex. And that part of the brain has two different groups of cells. The information comes in and it searches for the outer group of cells, which is called your limbic system. What that is asking is, am I safe? So when the world is familiar, you're in a place that you know, you're with people that you know, you're in an environment that you've been in before. What's called your amygdala, don't worry about the terminology, but that remains calm and tells the rest of your body, I feel safe, and you're more relaxed. As we send that information to our nervous system, we regulate it through the cerebral cortex. So that's the bit that regulates that thought. So if you're in an environment where you feel safe, you're happy, you're calm, might be out on the football pitch with friends. If all of a sudden you feel a tremor through the ground, what happens? Shit, I'm not safe. And you start to run. And it's a different part of your brain where the amygdala is telling you you're not safe. It's not familiar. if it's different, there's a different understanding. So in essence, what we are, and we've always thought of ourselves as a human race, as thinking creatures that feel. But in actual fact, we're feeling creatures that think. Does that make sense? So we think that we live in a very left brain dominant society, and I'll come to it later. But that means that the society we live in thinks that we think first and we feel later. Science tells us we feel first and we think later. When it comes to a teenager and the teenage brain and its developing brain, when you grew up as children or as parents of children, I know I certainly am, I know Mike, you've got children, how often did you hear phrases like, "What happened to my little angel? I don't understand you anymore. You used to really like all this stuff." Or my classic that I have with my kids is, "I'm not comfortable with your new friends." Have you either heard that as parents, as a child from your parents, or have you thought it of parents about your own children? I see Sam nodding. Anyone else? Nods of heads or thumbs up. Things that you've heard and felt before. There is a biological reason for it. So when we are born, we have twice as many brain cells as we'll ever use. So in our early formative years, so kind of from birth up to the age of about 3, the stem cells that are stimulated will then link to a circuit, and others that aren't used as often will begin to die away, which is why you'll hear the phrase, "We only use half the brain that we've got." Yeah, scientifically, it's right. When you go from about 3 up to about the age of 12, we start to go into that process of everything is about me as an individual. Me, 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 me. Look at me, look at what I've done. Where's my food? What am I getting? Yeah, all that toddler through early years, it's all about yourself. Your communication, your movement, everything's about you. Now, right the way up and including our teenage years, the emotional circuits in our brain develop at an awful lot faster rate than those logical circuits. So when we talk about the neuroelasticity and being able to create a circuit in our brain to help us form a reaction, from me, 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 we all of a sudden at teenage years start to think about, "Oh, you're cute. I like her, I like him." And your emotional connections with people are an awful lot more prevalent than whether or not it's a logical decision. So when we think left brain and right brain, we've got both parts there. Everyone has the ability to use both parts of that brain. But as a child and through our teenage years, we are firing the neurons in the right-hand side of our brain an awful lot quicker and easier than we are on the left-hand side. So when we talk about things like technical detail in a football environment, as a young child, that probably isn't going to fire many neurons. So the way we position these type of things has to be with a creative and imaginative element. We've got to start to inspire the right-hand side of the brain within a teenager. Everyone with me at this point? Yeah? Any questions? Feel free to ask me them. I know everyone's on mute, but feel free. Everyone happy for me to carry on? Cool. So when we think about that element, we start to hit teenage years, puberty and adolescence. They're often combined, and we talk about how children go through puberty and adolescence, and they're two very different things. So again, I want to create a discussion. What is the difference between the two? Have yourselves again about 60 seconds, and I want you to define to me each. What's the difference? What's puberty? What's adolescence? Have 60 seconds. Okay, so anybody that's got what their feelings of a definition are on puberty or adolescence. Mike, I know you've come off mute. I will tell you your mic isn't great, as in not your name, but your microphone. So you may have to speak up a little bit, but Mike, go
I only came off mute because I was getting prepared to speak, but that's fine.
That's what I thought.
I was also going to quickly ask, sorry to go slightly off topic, John, but I was just wondering if Pav is being held prisoner by Sheikh Mohammed in Dubai.
It looks a bit that way.
It does, but no. I mean, the only thing I'd have said in terms of puberty and adolescence, John, is it? I mean, there are physical differences and mental differences. Would be my instinct.
Brilliant.
To both elements.
Okay. Okay.
I don't want to necessarily go on to what they are.
You're 100% right, and I'll come to it in a minute.
Is it puberty is to the certain age before, I think is, it might start, obviously with the girls, it starts quicker than with the boys.
Okay.
And it comes to, I think it depends obviously on different individuals, but generally probably around 17 age or something like that. And then the adolescence is that past that puberty is already mental and, like Mike said, physical things has been developed, especially physical things has been developed to a certain satisfaction level or with the teenagers and the young people. So puberty is to before, and then adolescence is after, when their thinking and the mental understanding is become more logic, more aware. They able to make logical decisions and all that kind of stuff.
Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty much the same. I thought puberty was like the development of the body, probably, and then adolescence is obviously more, I think, mental development of probably from the age of 16 to 20, maybe, if at a guess.
Okay.
But I don't really know.
Cool. Sam?
I'm not particularly advanced in this area, but I was under the same impression as Pav. Puberty really starts earlier than, or is like the kick, or the initial stage of going through development, puberty.
Okay.
Let me write down.
It's okay. Sorry.
I've got no idea.
They happen, John, am I right? They happen at the same time, don't they?
So they can do. They can do. Prem, have you got anything to add?
No, I think I agree that like puberty would be the start of kind of growing up and going into the adolescence phase, when then you move to adulthood. So yeah, I think something like that.
So look, nobody said anything that's wrong, and nothing is wrong really in this. And Mike, you're right. Both things can happen at the same time. To give you a bit of a definition on it, puberty is the physiological changes to the self, and that the individual has no control over. So those parts of, hair growing in places that we didn't have before, deepening of voices, things getting bigger that weren't so big before, that kind of thing. We can't help with those changes. Children are going to go through them. It's as simple as that, and it's understanding what's happening to their body that ultimately they go through. With adolescence, it's the move from childhood into adulthood. So those are the psychological changes to an individual as they decide who they're going to become. So one's physiological, one's psychological, but they can happen together. I just want to introduce you to something called attachment theory as well. I'm not going to go into it loads because we haven't got the time here. Attachment theory is to do with who people become attached to. Now, as a child, as an infant and as a child, the attachment theory is always with the primary caregiver, be that mother, father, step-parents, whoever it might be, sometimes things like nursery teachers and primary school teachers as well. When we start to hit teenage years, that attachment theory can change massively in terms of who people become attached to and therefore who they want to impress. We'll come on to it again in a second. So behavior will change as the brain restructures. As the logical side of your brain catches up, the relationships that have been built determine the circuits that are created. So it has impacts on other relationships, friend groups, the primary caregiver, as teenagers begin to push boundaries. So we're now starting to see the emotional side of the brain being caught up by the logical side of the brain. And that's the adolescence, the psychological part of it in terms of the brain as we develop. Everyone happy? So when we start to think about the teenage brain, the last part of this brain that comes online is what's called the prefrontal cortex. Now that is the bit that's responsible for planning, impulse control, understanding consequences, and of course, appropriation of actions. When we think about teenagers now, would all of those things come into the bit that teenagers always need a bit of help with? It's because it's the last part of the brain that starts to create circuits. It's the bit where we're not sure, we make impulse decisions because we haven't thought about consequences. You don't think about whether or not your actions are appropriate. It's why our teenage years are really the years that you determine who you want to be. And the interests that children have had can sometimes be lost if they're not continued. It's why sport is always a real steady continuation for a lot of children. It's something they've been interested in through a young age, and it's a constant that can carry on through into adulthood, which is why as sports coaches, it's really important that we help them along that pathway and continue to help mold their life around the sport, because it's the constant that keeps you going from A to B. In terms of the physiological changes, the long bones in your body, things like femurs and spines, don't actually stop growing until you're 25, which is why when physiologically you become an adult, your development in terms of your puberty is over, but essentially your brain is then becoming established as well. So if you go back to that left side of the brain versus right side of the brain, we said earlier, what's most prevalent in the society? Well, logical parts of brain is most prevalent. We're feeling creatures that will think, yet we live in a left brain dominated society. And that means that we actually tend to value what people think over what they feel. We care more about the me than the we. We reward people for what they do rather than who they are. We care, so we focus on personal gain rather than community. We care about profits rather than people, and we strive for authority rather than equality. So that's the type of thing that teenagers have to start to deal with, and why they can drift into that left brain society when they've always been really firing on the right side. If we start to think about what this all means for us and our conclusion, we talk at Pavfunball about motivated to play, confident to play, and competent to play. Now, if children are very right-brained and they're going into teenage years where they're starting to see very left brain orientated society, that changes who they are quite dramatically. So when we think about being motivated to play, are we able to understand the emotions that players are getting from a non-football perspective? Can we understand it? We don't have to solve problems, but can we understand it? Do we know what the players actually want to achieve? Because if we're trying to ask them to achieve something that they're not really interested in, how many people are going to be motivated? Whether they're left or right-hand side brain. And as I mentioned earlier, who do the players try to impress when they're there? So when they're there and we're coaching them, who are they trying to impress? Are they likely to be trying to impress mum and dad on the sideline? Are they likely to be trying to impress us as a coach? Often not. So can things like our language change how we motivate players to play? When we think about confident to play, what does praise look like? I've seen it talked about before, and even with ourselves, are we praising for the sake of praising? And when you think back to that original image of the teenage brain, is praise for the sake of praise really going to inspire anyone? Probably not, and certainly not for a teenager. Do the players want to learn and show off what they can do? If so, let them do it. That's what's going to fire them. That's what's going to get the right neurons creating the right circuits for creativity. Really important for me is reflection on previous sessions to allow memory recall. As children go from right brain to left brain and their logical emotions, logical neurocircuits start to fire, they can sometimes get confused, and therefore memory recall can sometimes be an issue. We've got to help them fire those neurons more often because it creates better circuitry for later in life. When we talk about competent to play, my thoughts here are the players comfortable with the changes to their own bodies? Things like movement. Children going into teenage years can often struggle with things that might have been easy. Balance, for example, the real easy one to think about. Are we aware of it? Do we allow for it? Can players identify what they're supposed to be doing, even if they can't physically do it? Because that helps create those neurocircuits, again, for later in life. And can players construct their own plans to improve? Do we often have conversations with kids at the end of the sessions about what they can do to take what they've learned and continue it, again, helping to fire those neurocircuits? So I hope that I haven't baffled you too much with too much science. I thought it was important to understand why psychology is important. It's not just a case of the FA put it as a fourth corner on their four-corner model, and now that's something to think about. Psychology of all people changes, but it changes rapidly through the people that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And hopefully you'll get some understanding of why that is and what we can do to help them along that journey. That's me done. I'm not sure how much time we've got left. I have had one notification say time's coming, but I'm happy to take questions and open the floor for a discussion.
John, just a quick one, mate. That I think you're on unlimited minutes. I got a message saying the meeting had been upgraded, so you're not going to worry about.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So also, there was one other thing I was quickly going to say.
So that's good.
As you know, for future reference.
Yeah.
Your presentation bit, did you know that we were seeing all the pages?
All my notes?
Yeah.
I wasn't sure. I really struggled to get it up on full screen, but obviously I got my notes there. I've also printed them out if you wanted to see them. Can you still see me?
Yeah, it was just to let you know.
I've got them up here as well, printed.
Yeah, well, we were seeing that and your bit that we were coming on to, so I just thought I'd let you know.
Oh, right, okay.
Future.
Not to worry.
But presumably, that my main point on it, John, is presumably this is all of what you've said here is affected by the ages of the children that you're dealing with. Yeah. Because, for example, 4 and 5 year olds probably are trying to impress you or their parents or their mates.
Yeah, and a lot to do with attachment theory there.
Yeah. Okay, mate.
Cool.
I think the one thing I learned definitely, and that's what is, is good to collaborate between coaches in a very open, remember our environment here. is open. We can throw out anything really, what we think, or our own experiences, and then go anywhere else, just be a part of our environment. But here it's open. But one thing I would say is that 90 seconds bit from the moment you, and now when I'm looking my experience working with both children and teenagers, I can see and recall as many examples now when that 90 seconds things happen, when the child just kick off for whatever reason. It was anything really, and after that, and there was some when after, like you said, 90 seconds, it was okay, or possibly a bit longer, but that's it. No longer, definitely no longer than 2 minutes. But for others, it was just keep going and keep going and keep going. And I remember one example with our futsal when I was with Sam, and there was, for whatever reason, the lad simply was just didn't want to play with the other team. Because we give him an opportunity to play with both, then we took a decision to actually, okay, so now you need to go and play and just mixed up to make the team a bit fairer. And then he just kick off. He just tried to throw everything and kick for balls. And we've been calm. I've experienced enough. But that's the.
So if you think about it scientifically, if you think about it scientifically, Pav, you've got the trigger that created the anger. Now, essentially, what that trigger is that I can't have my own way. So the physiological response comes through, and it actually flushes out by the time the adrenaline's gone within 90 seconds. But if the child's still kicking off, it's because they're still thinking about the trigger of I'm not getting my own way. Yeah. And it's how we go about dealing with that part rather than the behavior.
And it's good. Yeah, I agree. We always have to deal with the behavior, not the person. But I think that this is what I'm talking. This is a great learning point. Why something happened. It's important to understand. If we have previous knowledge, that's fine about that child, so we know what might happen. We know. But when we meet completely new group, especially in schools or McDonald's, sometimes we don't know what kid's coming up. Other than that, we know their medical history, but other than we don't know this kid might kick off, but it's important to know and always deal with the behavior rather than the person, because but it's not always easy. In my experience, you not always solve things. Generally you will, but there are some times when you have to, as long as it's safe, let that kid just get that frustration off and calm down and then come and talk to him when he's there. And the same thing with adult environment. So I can speak with many different examples, but I didn't know that. So it's a great knowledge to have, that 90 seconds. So now this is good. It's really good. Yeah. So
cool. Anything from anyone else?
Oh yeah, I've got a question for you, John. We talked about how age could impact this. What about gender, so male and female? Okay. Are there any? Have you noticed any significant differences?
So, in terms of that process, in terms of the brain development, how it happens, there's no difference in gender. Now, what I think, as Pav alluded to earlier, what we tend to see is that girls will hit puberty quicker. They don't necessarily hit adolescence any quicker. So although they have the physiological changes, the brain doesn't necessarily go through the psychological changes at the same rate. So that is quite gender neutral. Puberty is, very much that girls have a tendency to go through it first. Not always. There's always exceptions. Not always, but in terms of the psychological part and the psychological changes to the brain, that's consistent across genders.
All right, thank you.
Cool. Well, if there's nothing from anyone else, I thank you for your time. I hope it was worthwhile.
Very good, John. Thank you, mate.
Yeah, thanks, John.